that this is the greatest crisis facing the Chinese Communist Party since Tiananmen Square is a statement that one hears after almost every scandal in China, and it eventually starts to sound almost like a cliché. But the obvious thing to point out is that at some point there has to be a crisis that warrants the comparison, and it's hard to think what this crisis would be if not the coronavirus. I believe that this is the greatest challenge that the party has faced this century. And how the party will look when it emerges is one of the most important questions for not only China's but now the world's future. To understand the origins of the current political infighting that's embroiled the Communist Party, you have to look at the type of politics developed during Xi Jinping's time as leader. And how the party got to this stage is a fascinating insight into the nature of one-party rule, and the conflict that this kind of system creates. So first of all, Xi Jinping himself owes his position to a round of political infighting that took place in the previous generation of China's leaders. And this conflict was one of the main reasons that he adopted his calculating style. So in the late 2000s, the Chinese leadership was split between the then Chinese president Hu Jintao and the previous president Jiang Zemin, who'd formally stepped down in 2002. Under Jiang Zemin, China had embarked on its ambitious financial reform and privatization of the late 90s, and then entered the World Trade Organization, which paved the way for years of record-breaking economic growth. Hu Jintao had inherited a much richer country, but by the mid-2000s, China was becoming one of the most unequal countries in the world. Hu's second term was coming up quickly, which meant that a new successor would have to be found who was not too old, but still had the experience to run the party. Also because this would be the first leader not specifically endorsed by Deng Xiaoping, there was no clear line of succession. The political battle that came next saw the factions of the two leaders pitted against each other. Jiang Zemin's group is known as the Shanghai clique, because of the development policies that he oversaw in Shanghai in the 90s. Hu Jintao's group is called the Youth League, because of the time he spent as leader of that department. Jiang and the Shanghai clique wanted a candidate that would create further economic growth, whereas Hu and the Youth League wanted one that would focus on stabilization. Corruption at this time was becoming one of China's most important issues. Especially with the rise of the internet, it was becoming much harder for the CCP to conceal scandals of corrupt officials. A famous example is the Li Gang incident, where a drunk driver ran down two students in Hubei province, and then told the arriving police, who came to arrest him, "Go ahead, sue me if you dare, my father is Li Gang." Li Gang was later found to be the director of the local security bureau, which obviously made very people online very unhappy, and "我爸是 Li Gang" became an internet slogan that was used to highlight corruption. President Hu Jintao's choice to be the next president was Li Keqiang, who's now China's premier, because both officials had previously led the Youth League. Jiang Zemin's choice was a former mayor of Shanghai called Chen Liangyu. But because Jiang Zemin had mostly bought allegiance from most of his supporters in the party by bribing them, Hu Jintao cleverly anticipated some foul play, and decided to investigate Mayor Chen. And sure enough, once he was placed under investigation, the mayor was found to have embezzled more than $1.25 billion from Shanghai's social security fund. So with his prime candidate now in prison, Jiang Zemin and the Shanghai clique turned instead towards a very ambitious reformer called Bo Xilai, who was the mayor of Chongqing at the time, which is one of China's major industrial centres. Bo Xilai was known for his creation of a movement called Red Culture, which aimed to take down the black mafia, but actually just took the mafia's money and put it inside Bo's private accounts. And largely because of Bo Xilai's attempt at a Maoist-style personality cult, Bo had very little support among the rest of the party to be the next leader. But this had the effect of denying Bo promises of power that would later come back to haunt the party leaders. Xi Jinping had risen through the ranks quickly as an official, and made a name for himself by being especially tough on corruption while he was Secretary of Zhejiang. This was itself a farce, as Xi Jinping had in fact presided over a multi-billion-dollar smuggling ring in Xiamen in the late 1990s while he was governor there. But apart from him, there were a few other candidates who had both the age requirements and the experience, and he was settled on as a compromise basically between Hu Jintao and Jiang, as a moderator between the two factions because neither wanted to nominate the other's candidate. But just as Xi was being groomed to take over the party leadership, the party found that a new faction had been created around Bo Xilai, supported by the Shanghai clique, which felt that it had been cheated because of the nomination of Xi and wanted to carve out power for itself. The full nature of this plot would come to light after the death of a British businessman in a Chongqing hotel room in 2011. Neil Haywood was a middleman for the Bo family, and he'd managed the family's business assets abroad and helped them secure business negotiations in England. After a while, Haywood had tried to negotiate a higher commission for his services, and he then threatened to reveal the family's undeclared business assets to the Chinese government unless he got paid more. Bo Xilai's wife then responded by having Mr. Haywood poisoned in a hotel room, and all of this would have been a job well done if Bo's vice mayor had not then fled to the US consulate to seek asylum after he'd stolen millions of dollars for himself and told them everything. This then created a serious problem for the Chinese leadership because the Western media now knew about everything that happened. So the party called a meeting in March 2012 and decided that Bo had to be taken down. So he was placed under house arrest and put on trial shortly after. But this entire conspiracy was only just getting started, because it became apparent that Bo had created a network around him with similar promises of political power. So Bo had on his side the head of China's secret police, a man called Zhou Yongcan, who had headed the 610 office, which had overseen the imprisonment and execution of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners, a meditation group in the late 1990s. As chief of secret police, Zhou had files on every corrupt CCP official in the country, and the plan was reportedly to use these files to guarantee Zhou and Bo Xilai a seat at the next Politburo, and he enlisted the head of the discipline office, whose son had just been found dead in a crashed Ferrari, surrounded by naked prostitutes. In exchange for covering up this embarrassing incident, Zhou wanted his support, and together they formed an alliance with several military officials. After the poisoning of Neil Haywood by Bo Xilai came to light and Bo went down for it, these plans pretty much went out the window, and Zhou Yongcan and his gang suddenly found themselves in a cat and mouse game with the Chinese party leaders. Things came to a head in March 2012, a few days after the downfall of Bo, when a middleman with knowledge of the whole conspiracy was detained in Beijing. Zhou entered the city with his armed police to take the witness back by force. President Hu Jintao then called the military into Beijing to apprehend Zhou, and after a standoff between Zhou's police forces and the military, where the police apparently fired warning shots in the air, they were disarmed, and Zhou Yongcan escaped apparently through an underground tunnel in Zhongnanhai. Thereafter, Zhou was stripped from all his positions within the party, but not actually tried. The reason for this appears to be that he was still being sheltered by former President Jiang Zemin and the Shanghai clique. Zhou had managed to build up a base of support inside of the Chinese military, and he spent the next few months in private residences. The next few months would see a campaign where there was a total of 6 attempts on Xi Jinping's life in late 2012, according to several outlets in Hong Kong, which forced him to disappear for 2 weeks. In 2013, the CCP formally tried Bo Xilai and gave the approval to arrest and prosecute Zhou Yongcan for corruption. He then emerged after days in detention, a lot thinner, with his hair completely white, and confessed to crimes of corruption within the party. But even though Zhou Yongcan was out of the way, there was still a vast political network that was working against Xi Jinping. In the months following Bo's confession, the group launched a series of political attacks against the president from inside the party, which ranged from exposés on corruption inside his family to a hacking campaign. This was when Xi Jinping gave the "Tigers and Flies" speech, where he said that his anti-corruption campaign had reached a stalemate and that he was willing to give his life to see it through. 2014 would see the final phase of the takedown of Zhou Yongcan's patronage gang. Through the discipline office director, Zhou had formed a vast network of supporters known as the Xishan Society, which translates to the West Mountain Society, which was a secret group that guaranteed political favours and operated in Shanxi province, which is China's coal country. Its members were mostly made up of Hu Jintao's youth league, and in August, Xi managed to finally politically surround the society and imprison a record 15,000 party officials. Later in 2014, the military general Xu Caihou, who had allegedly conspired with Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongcan, was formally put under investigation for corruption. Another general, Guo Boxiong, followed him in 2015, and in the same year Xi Jinping purged the entire Chinese military and removed more than 300,000 members from it, most of whom had been part of Jiang Zemin's remaining faction. Chinese state media after the arrest of the conspirators claimed that Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongcan, Lin Jihua and Xu Caihou together had formed a new Gang of Four, after the Gang of Four led by Mao's wife during the Cultural Revolution that had overseen mass political purges. The final purge of Jiang's faction from the party in 2015 represents Xi Jinping's consolidation of power within the CCP, and the end of the first phase of his anti-corruption campaign. With this, both the Shanghai clique and the Youth League factions, which had first nominated Xi, had been brought to their knees. The second phase of his campaign would see its expansion into the legal system, finance and civil society, and set the stage for his final party takeover in 2018.